Thank you very much for the introduction. And my apologies for not being Carola. I know you all look forward to listening to her. I know that I always do. So I'll do my very best to make this worth your time anyway. And we wish Carola all the best for a speedy recovery so that she can join us again very soon. So my topic today, as Craig mentioned, is not at all controversial. Is DDD overrated? In fact, my first version of this slide deck had DDD is overrated as the title. I decided that that's a little too much because I don't really believe that. And the question is intended to provoke a bit. So I'll start my talk with a disclaimer first. And that disclaimer essentially says that I am a fan of domain-driven design. I do not consider it wrong. I don't think it's something that you should be doing. I think it's absolutely worth exploring. So we could end this talk early with that statement. But of course, I'm going to point out some things that I consider worthy of exploring and worthy of considering as potential pitfalls when you adopt domain-driven design. I am also, and that's very important to me, a big fan of the domain-driven design community. It's an awesome, very welcoming community. I think it bridges a lot of gaps that shouldn't have been there in the first place. I think that it's full of fantastic people. I like the authors that are well known. I like the practitioners. And you probably or possibly know that for us as a company, for INNOQ, DDD plays a very important role. It's somehow done to a more or less explicit degree in practically every project we do. We make money with domain-driven design, so let's criticize it. That's my view. We should be questioning everything, and that includes domain-driven design. So my assumption is that most of you will be familiar with the topic as such. I'll still spend maybe 5 minutes introducing it for those who aren't, and maybe for those who already know it, to make clear what my view on the whole topic is. So the first thing is to come up with a definition. This is sort of our standard go-to definition when we need one, when we need to quickly explain something. And in this definition, domain-driven design is an approach that emphasizes domain knowledge, which I think is a very good idea, a crucial idea, and which incidentally is something that Carola always mentions in her talks, as well as a very explicit goal. That's far more important than any technical aspect, and we all know that architects sometimes focus too much on technology, too much on the technical details, and ignore the domain. We'll get back to that statement later. In this approach, we put the domain at the center of things, and we expect the software to implement a domain model that matches the user's expectations. So the software we're building reflects what users need, what the domain experts understand. And I think that's sort of a common, possibly easy to agree on definition of domain-driven design. There is a slightly more formal one, which is taken from the original Eric Evans book. It's an approach that focuses on the core domain. That's the same thing. It explores models in a collaborative fashion. That is something that's been detailed a lot in the last few years. We will not talk a lot about that, but I'll mention it briefly. Has this idea of a ubiquitous language, of a language that everyone can understand. People who are very technical, people who are domain experts, users, practitioners, everybody concerned with the topic at hand, every stakeholder should be able to use their language, and it should be a common language among everyone involved. So this thing is sort of a key aspect of domain-driven design, this ubiquitous language. We have, we don't risk misunderstandings because we want to be creative with inventing new words. This might take many forms. It might be that somebody overgeneralizes, abstracts things that should not be abstracted, and comes up with their own terms that are not understood by domain experts. It might be a language issue. We're quite often in projects where there's a language in addition to English, so it's typically German, might be something else. And then you have this issue of deciding whether you want to have everything in English or things in German. We actually tend to name things in the way that they're commonly named within a company, so that quite often is actually German. Instead of coming up with our own translations that are typically wrong, we simply adopt the term, even if that means a mixture of languages. That's, I think, a very good aspect, and that is, to me, one of the core contributions. It seems like something that should be obvious, but all the great things should be obvious, but aren't. So it's always nice if somebody makes them explicit and actually highlights why this is important and how to go about it. And this is one of these things. It seems kind of absolutely obvious that you should be using the language of the people for whom you are building something, but very often it's not the case. So that's key aspect number one. Key aspect number two from the book is actually a set of tactical patterns. And Eric Evans himself has said that the order he placed things might have been different. But at that point in time, when the book came out, that was in the early 2000s, this was sort of a capturing of best practices on how to build object-oriented software. So these are building blocks, as you can call them, that like entities and aggregates and value objects and so on, that sort of are a common vocabulary of talking about architectural concepts in the small, right? So these are tactical patterns to structure your software, and they're more or less well defined. You can read up on what the responsibilities of an entity are, what the responsibilities of an aggregate are, what the differences are to a value object, and then you can use those terms, talk to your peers using that vocabulary, and profit from that. So that's a good thing. I also think it's a problem, and we'll get to that in a second. The last part, and to me actually the most interesting and important, and again kind of obvious, but as I said, obvious is good, part of the whole thing is the idea of strategic design, applying design criteria to the system or the systems as a whole. And there are a lot of very interesting, intriguing things here. I think the most important contribution of this part of the book is the bounded context. We'll talk about that in a second. But also the relationships between different teams or different parts of the system, and the power dynamics that exist between people who influence that stuff. This is all very, very relevant. And if you've ever been in a project that involves more than, say, 10 people, you've run into most of these things, because they are they are a very good strategy to structure software in the large. And you need something like that, similar to that, if you want to be successful in building larger software systems. So let me dwell a bit on this bounded context idea. So what you can see here are three bounded contexts just taken out of thin air: order management, accounting, and fulfillment. This might be some e-commerce scenario. And the key idea here is that each of those contexts is sort of a box around a meaning of words. That's sort of my very simplified definition here. So if you look at order management, there's a product and a customer, but you also have a product and a customer in the accounting bounded context. And of course, they have a relationship. Hopefully, they have a relationship. We're talking about the same organization here, but they're not the same thing. It's sort of the approach to address the problem of things becoming too big because they want to be everything to everybody. So the other way of going about this would be to assign somebody the product person, and then that product person would walk around the company and talk to everybody and ask, what do you think a product is? And then keeps adding attributes and responsibilities to that product thing, until that product thing has 1,000 attributes and millions of responsibilities. And we all know where that ends. It ends in those database tables with way too many columns that can't be changed by anyone because nobody knows who touches them anymore. And the idea of a bounded context is quite straightforwardly to say that a product in the order management context is different from a product in the accounting context, and that's fine. They might have a one-to-one relationship or not, but they're different things because they're in a different context of meaning here. So that said, these three things are sort of in the core book, and are sort of the most well-known aspects. There is this fourth one that I'm not going to dwell on for a longer time, which is all of these collaborative modeling techniques. And that's a shame, because they're extremely interesting, and a lot has happened there in the last few years. In the last few years, very few people have, say, added new tactical patterns or had discussions about that. Well, that's not true. Some people have, of course, discussed that, but it hasn't been at the core of what people spend their time on if they're in the domain-driven design community. This, though, is something that a lot of people have innovated a lot in, and that's an extremely interesting thing. Sadly, it's not our focus today because we can't talk about everybody. So I'll just be talking about these first three core aspects and go about my sort of problems with them. So let's address some of the things that I aim to criticize in a constructive fashion. The first one is the idea of conceptual extensibility. So I think that this idea, this ubiquitous language, is actually something that you could generalize and talk about in a very meta level. So a ubiquitous language is sort of a shared language among people from different parts of a context, an organization, from different teams. And in a certain fashion, the things that I just talked about, all of these words like entity and aggregate and value object and bounded context and conformist, whatever, all of the words that I used are the domain-driven design language. It's sort of the way we talk about things when we adopt this particular approach. And that's a very good thing. So by using that, and that I think is a very common pattern in architectural discussions, by doing that, we simplify our lives because we don't have to explain everything from scratch every time we want to talk about something. If I talk to somebody who knows something about domain-driven design, I can say, well, this context is composed of, or this context includes three aggregates, and those are these three things. And if you want to zoom into detail, then this aggregate relates to these entities. So I can use those words, and I can simply assume that my communication partner knows what I'm talking about. And a key thing to me here is that needs to be extensible. I mean, this shared jargon will get new words in it, right? So that's a good thing. It's very good if you add things because you use that approach to simplify your life even further. And that means that it's extensible. It's not fixed. It should not be a set of things that are closed, right? So any set of predefined best practices patterns needs to be a starting point, something that you use to not have to start from scratch so that you can evolve from there. And I strongly believe that the same is true for those tactical patterns as well. And I'm pretty sure that this is something that many people in the domain-driven design community will agree with. So I'm not saying I'm not suggesting or claiming that I'm coming up with something completely new here, but my experience is that some people seem to think if it's not in this list, then it's not domain-driven design, and it can't be good if it's not domain-driven design, which I find extremely sad. The core idea to me is that this should be extensible by whatever makes sense in your context. Maybe your filters or rules or proxies or contracts or roles or whatever it is that plays a reasonable role in your architecture. And the same idea of extending those patterns and adding to them is, in my view, true for the context relationships as well. This might even be more relevant from a strategic point of view because we're discovering things that are very much dependent on the power dynamics of a certain organization. Every organization is different. Of course, you can take stuff from one to the next or experience from one to the next, but every organization will be different. So these relationships might be an excellent starting point. You know, like I have a customer-supplier relationships between these two teams and these two parts of the software that they're responsible for. If you know what that means, if you can read it up quickly, then that gives you extra vocabulary or useful vocabulary to talk about what that means and what you can do about it. If you can say, well, let's add an anti-corruption layer here, same thing is true as well. But you might have additional things that are specific to your context, like maybe a formal contracts, or you have a shared spec, a third-party standard. Whatever makes sense to you should be possible to add to this particular language. So the ubiquitous language or the meta language on this particular level should be just as extensible as the language of the actual domain you're implementing. And that's one of those meta things, right? You always lose 50% of your audience if you use the word meta. But I believe it's something that we as architects should be familiar with, because in every project I've been involved with, it's always been a sign of quality and good communication and good understanding if there was such a shared vocabulary that was specific to this particular project, because that means that you get this shared understanding of how to approach things or how not to approach things. I'm not going to use an entity here because that's not the right approach, whatever makes sense to you there. So this is my first criticism. Again, I'm not saying everybody in the domain-driven design community believes that these technical patterns are the end in itself, or these context relationships. I think too many people simply accept what's there as the only thing that's possible, the only thing that can be used, and I find that quite sad. So that's my first thing. The second thing is the question, should design be domain-driven, right? And I sort of hinted at my agreement with Carola there, and I even had a slide in another slide deck that diagnosed this disease here, domain allergy. The idea that I'm way too cool to be bothered with some domain thing that's relevant to a bank or an insurance company or anything boring like that, right? I want to be dealing with complex technical stuff. Way too many people have that attitude, specifically when they're starting out, when they're becoming young, smart, motivated architects. And the reason I can so confidently say that is that I suffered from this disease for quite some time before I learned to love the domain. Right? So I think this is quite common, and it's not a good thing. I think we should address this. We'll get to that in a second. I think we have in the domain-driven design community an appreciation for this idea of separating core business logic from separate details, and it's totally understandable why that happens. So these approaches where you have some external technical dependency and some way to abstract yourself or your business logic from that stuff is a very meaningful thing. Whether you call that ports and adapters or hexagonal architecture or clean architecture, it doesn't really matter to me, right? So those are all very good approaches, and their goal is to make the domain pure, right? To have that core thing abstract and domain, and I totally buy that, and I think it's an awesome idea. The problem with this awesome idea is that there are other diseases other than domain allergy, and the one I want to point at here is reality aversion, and that is the failure to recognize that what's good in theory isn't always good in practice. And you can see that by people who identify too much with any particular topic. So if somebody talks exclusively about one particular technological or methodological approach, the risk is that they will see this as the solution to everything, everywhere, all the time. And nothing qualifies as that. There is no such thing at all. It should always be clear that you decide based on the context. And that is my second criticism, or my second category of criticism of how some people approach domain-driven design. So let me ask that question again. Should design be domain-driven? I think there are two answers to that particular question. The first one is that, yes, of course, it should be driven by the domain and not by technology. I think we've learned that it's an excellent idea to place users first, and not proxies for those users, but actual users who are the people, the humans who actually will use what we build there. And whatever the experts and the stakeholders and the people who are working with the business domain or non-technical domain in general that we're looking at here, whatever those people use and talk about should drive what we do here. I think that's kind of very, very obvious, and we should be doing that. But what I also firmly believe is that not every piece of software needs to be built in that fashion that I just showed you. This core in the middle that is completely technology neutral. That does not mean it's a bad thing. That does not mean that I criticize that as something you shouldn't be doing. What I'm saying is that you should not assume that this approach works everywhere all the time. Because, as I said, nothing is true for that. So let me give you an example, or a few examples of other approaches that are very different from putting an object-oriented core in the middle. So the first one would be to adopt the relational model, and that sounds like I just traveled here from the past. Who brought this guy from 30 years ago or 40 years ago to our time here? Sometimes your problem domain matches to a solution domain that's very much suited for extensive use of a relational database. Relational databases are awesome. The problem is that most people don't know how to use them. But if you know what you're doing, and you probably have met or you are a database expert who knows what they're doing, then you will know that they can do awesome things with very little amount of code, with excellent performance and long-term maintainability. Okay, I didn't really say maintainability. That really depends on how good they are. But sometimes a relational approach is an excellent idea. Just use a database. Just adopt the more advanced features that it has, maybe even to create things like XML or JSON, or to map some object-oriented or spatial stuff, whatever it is that you can do with those things. Sometimes they're a great match here. Now, as I'm saying, I'm not saying you should do this every time. I'm not saying your programming language code written in some object-oriented language should just be calling stored procedures every time. All I'm saying is that sometimes that is the right approach. And you probably all have this sort of lever that you put to one side or the other, depending on how much you rely on the database. Trying to abstract those things completely away very often leads to horrible performance. And I've seen many systems that were very pure from a domain-driven design perspective and had this core, but performed like a dog because they simply joined in memory. So they did lots of stuff that the database could have done very efficiently and quickly, just because they wanted to avoid using the database. So that's just one example. Let me jump to the other side of the stack, which would be to have things UI or UX driven. Very often, the most important aspect, most often probably, but at least very often, the most important aspect is what does your application do for its users? And very often you should validate that very early on in the project. And if you think from that side of things, if you start from that side of things, then very often things become driven by that. They're not driven by starting with the domain. They're driven by starting with what it is that users want to do with the application or with the website or with whatever it is that you're building there. Now, you can slowly move from there, and the domain might not, it sounds as if the domain is of course always important, but the key approach here to find out what it is that the domain does is to start from what it provides to its users. Now, that seems like completely the opposite of the domain-driven design approach with a core, a business core domain. But sometimes that is the better approach because your domain, frankly, isn't that super complicated. It doesn't really have that much complexity. If everything that you're doing is putting stuff from some form into the database and reading it back out, then maybe your domain logic can be very, very slim. Again, this is not true. This is not true at all times. So you have to be very careful to pick the right approach here. But you can end up with great systems that are driven like this. Sometimes the exact opposite is true. Sometimes your domain is super complicated, and the value your application derives is not at all in anything related to displaying stuff in a particularly nice fashion or storing tons of data, tons of boring data. Sometimes you really have a very complicated core domain. Like maybe it's got extremely complicated calculation rules, or it's got a super complex object-oriented model here. And then you can use a mathematical approach to the whole thing and try to define the rules of the language that allow you to say true things as part of your code. That sounds a little weird. It's actually something that practitioners of functional programming do a lot. I had two very interesting podcasts on the Case podcast, which I'm part of, with one of my colleagues, Lars Huppel, and another iSAQB member, Mike Sperber, about how to go about these things. Right? I strongly recommend that you give those things a listen because they can explain it much better than I can. And they talked a lot about how they can achieve these algebraic semantics in a core language to make it easier to not only formulate things that you know, but also find out new things that you could have known if you had been aware that these are valid and true statements in your particular language. So that's sort of the opposite again. So one application might be driven extremely by simple data. One application might be driven by by user experience, one application might be driven by this mathematical core. And there are lots of other approaches. Let me pick one that's sort of a little out of fashion, but still to me an absolutely valid approach. That would be the model-driven approach, whether you call that model-driven architecture or whether you talk about textual DSLs or model-driven engineering. And it doesn't really matter. This is sort of the idea of having a technology-independent model. I did a podcast about that as well with Markus Völter. He's also very well known in this particular community, and argued for a strong relation between this model-driven engineering approach and domain-driven design. And we had a lot of debate about this particular thing. Now, this would be the idea of giving domain experts a language to allow them to write or at least read programs. So the language is matches the domain so perfectly that a domain expert can use it to formulate what they want or what they know to be true, as opposed to telling some programmer what they want, right? So that's an approach that has worked and failed and worked and failed again in many different contexts, but it is a valid approach in some cases, and you should also have it in your tool chest. So, am I arguing that any one of these is better than the core DDD thing? I'm not. In fact, I'm suggesting that you revisit this context idea. Let's talk again about this bounded context. That's from the strategic design, not the technical design part. The strategic design part that says something about how to separate things, right? So a bounded context is a description of a boundary, right? So typically there is a relation of that boundary to a software artifact. There might be a relation to a deployment artifact. So this might be, say, a microservice or a separate self-contained system or whatever it is that you chose for your particular architecture. But it also has a relation to a team, right? It's typically the work of a particular team. So in most contexts or in most situations, one team can own multiple contexts, multiple bounded contexts. But the idea is that a bounded context is not owned by separate teams. Right? So if you have that, then within this particular context, a particular model is applicable, right? And that you can extend that idea to cover other aspects as well. So take a look at this very simplified example that I had here. And I just picked randomly from my set of things and decided that maybe this could be a good strategy. So order management might be something that you present to your outside users. Obviously, most of the time it will be, right? So you put a very strong emphasis on usability. You very much want the users to do things in a most pain-free way. You want them never to cancel. You never want them to go back and reconsider whether they really want to buy that. You always want them to move forward and click that buy now button. So that should possibly be very much UX driven, and that is what should be at the core of this particular bounded context. The second one, the accounting, you might have very complex rules for whatever reason on how to calculate prices or benefits or extras or rebates. You might have fantastically complicated rules to distribute the revenue or the profit to other partners. There might be completely weird things going on there, and maybe that's such a complicated domain that you should be building it using one of those functional algebraic core concepts. And the fulfillment thing might be something where the domain is best modeled using classical object-oriented methods, using the technical DDD patterns. So the idea here is that within each context, you can make different decisions. Of course, this is easier if the context that we're talking about here also have a physical incarnation, right? If they're physical artifacts, like, for example, separate systems, it's much easier to do that. But think about the consequences. So one of my favorite examples is this. Every architect, at least every architect with an object-oriented, with an OOP background I talk to, always wants to abstract away the database, at least to a certain degree, some more, some less. But most people would agree that using proprietary features of your database is a warning sign. It's a smell. It's something that you should avoid. So if I present you with an architecture paper that says in chapter 1, we are going to use database X, whether it's blue or red, I don't mind. We're using database X, and we're going to use all of these database-specific, vendor-specific features, then you would rightly say that creates a very strong dependency to this particular vendor. Maybe it's a cloud vendor these days, who knows? But this very specific dependency might lead to problems down the road. And as architects, we want to create long-term maintainability. We want to abstract away those things. So that's a reasonable choice. The problem here is, or the reason we're doing this here is because that's an overarching sort of global decision here. I either allow or disallow the use of proprietary database features. And if I were to make that decision for a large system, I would also agree that we should not rely on proprietary features. But if I were just making that decision for a small part, if I had the whole thing decomposed into 10 bounded contexts, and for this one particular bounded context, it made sense, because using that approach, I can use proprietary database technology to get things done in 1/10 of the time with 10 times the performance, then of course I would do it. So splitting things into bounded contexts with clear boundaries gives you additional freedom of choice. And that, I think, is a very important concept here. So is DDD overrated? That was my initial question, right? So I strongly believe that strategic DDD is a fantastic starting point for large systems. I use it all the time. I talk about these concepts. I draw pictures. I advocate, or I suggest that people read the book. I strongly consider that to be a fantastic starting point. It's not the only one. People have been doing that, and they've been doing it with other names, and that's fine as well. You don't have to do domain-driven design to be cool. There is life beyond DDD, right? You can do it. It doesn't really matter. I found for my personal work that it helps. It helps me to get these ideas across. It's nice to be able to point to a body of knowledge, to a wealth of books and talks and blog posts and articles that all share this common ubiquitous language of domain-driven design. So I think it's a good thing. And from that point of view, I think you should do that. Tactical DDD, though, to me is just one of many great starting points. I'm not criticizing the particular things there. Well, maybe, but that would be a different talk, right? We could talk about the usefulness of aggregates and how to interact with the database. But those are all micro discussions. They're on a completely different level. And sometimes this approach is great, and sometimes it doesn't. It's not the best choice. You can make everything work, and you can make this work in every scenario as well. But sometimes it's just not a good match and will not lead to a good overall architecture. I really appreciate domain-driven design. I really appreciate its community. But again, like I said before, no solution is the only viable one. Don't fall into that trap. Be aware that there are many things that you could use, and just freely mix and match as you see fit for your particular context. So let me summarize, and then we can maybe address a few questions as well. So the first thing is, don't look just for one thing. I know it's it is understandable that people want to do that, right? You spend some time looking and you want to finally settle on something and use that everywhere. I don't think that is a possible opportunity. There's one exception, and that is if you become a technical expert on one particular thing, but that's a different role, right? If your role is to only talk about this particular thing, then you will be one of the people that others listen to, and that's fine. But it's not a good approach for designing an actual solution that needs to be delivered, because you will be applying just one of many solutions in all cases, and that's not something that works out. Recipes are awesome, and I think following rules is, particularly at the start, is fine. In fact, you can see in many talks, you hear somebody who's an expert at something telling you that the rules don't matter, and to a certain degree, although I'm not claiming to be an expert, I did something like that. I totally concede that very often, specifically when you start, you want to have clear guidance, specifically when you use something for the first time, or if you have a very inexperienced team, it's great to have some dogma. But don't stick to it in the long run. In the long run, you should be able to understand where to extend things, when to do things differently, and how to tailor things to your particular needs. And I think specifically in this architecture community that we're in at this conference, that is what we need to do, right? We need to be the ones who come up with a nice with a nice set of concepts that matches our particular context and our particular project. I love the idea of using these contexts as decision spheres, right? This is the boundary of my decision making. That's extremely liberating. You can try out things. You can try out things for the first time. You can move to a new version. You can use a completely different technology. You can risk something. You can use proprietary stuff. There are so many positive things about having that. And almost all of the downsides that I see in large projects come from ignoring this advice, come from trying to make everything the same across every situation. And I do, again, like you probably know, that it depends is the standard answer to everything, and this is true here as well, right? So I do appreciate that it's nice to do things in a similar way because it reduces cognitive load and you can more easily recognize things. Those are great values and I love having them, but you can definitely exaggerate that, over-exaggerate that, and come up with something that aims to be everything everywhere and just will never be a good solution in any particular place. So I hope that was at least a little interesting. I hope I did a reasonable job of replacing Carola, although I could never do that really. And I thank you, and I'm happy to answer some questions.
Thank you, Stefan. Thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you.
I really appreciate how kind of clear-headed and objective it was about things. And I love there's an idea in there that even a team's choice to use domain-driven design should be context-driven. Like perhaps DDD is not the best for all teams. We actually have a ton of questions already, so perhaps we'll just dive right into those. The first of which is, which domain language should be used in case of multiple human languages and different I'll continue. And different designations in each country? It is recommended to 1, translate everything into a common domain language first, or 2, should there be multiple domain languages implemented?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. It seems sort of trivial, but it really creates a lot of problems in practice. And that's why I don't have a perfect answer to that, right? So what I have seen failing a number of times is when technical experts try to do translation to English. So let's assume you're using German or Czech or whatever, and your code obviously is English because every library out there, every framework uses English. So you want to have things nicer and cleaner, and you start translating yourself. That is a sure path to disaster. It's the worst thing you could do because you have non-domain experts coming up with translations that very often make no sense in any language, whether human or domain, because they just look up a word, but that has a completely different connotation. And then in the end, the result is that although it's nominally English, it's actually a language that no one can understand, absolutely no one. So that's the worst thing you can do. Now, of course, there's a problem because if let's say you're with a French company that uses particular French words for French, I don't know, tax law, that'll probably be very, very specific, very French. So let's just assume you use those words, but maybe that company is on the brink of expanding to other countries and will soon globalize and will switch to English. I don't know if that's the case, then you of course have that as an issue, but it should be the domain experts who do that. They need to own the language, specifically the domain terms. So my recommendation would be figure out what creates the least pain. Sometimes that is just sticking with the native words, with the human language used in that particular context. Even though it might look a little weird, it might make things a lot clearer. Unless that's a bad idea, then do something different.
I guess as always, it depends.
Yeah, as I said, that's the easy answer to everything.
I think it's you spoke about extensible jargon, and I think there's an interesting thing in there about the domain expert kind of making those decisions. And I think one thing I've seen and heard people talk about at some other DDD events is just kind of this idea of maybe having like a central glossary for those terms, which I feel like could certainly help in that case with people taking on their own translations. Yeah.
Absolutely, and not only with software, right? I mean, that's
Yeah.
a very helpful thing for everybody who starts with a company who needs to get to know the domain to understand what business they're in. So it's kind of a no-brainer.
Great. I'm going to move on to question 2, which is, are there metrics to decide which implementation strategy works best for a particular bounded context?
Yeah, I wouldn't claim there are metrics. I think that would be a little, then our lives would be a little too easy. I do think there are some indicators. There are some things that make it a little more than a gut feeling what you're doing there, right? So you can judge the complexity of a domain quite often by the amount of description you need to do that. So I mean, we all know that there are those applications that are more or less standard data management things where there's sometimes a lot of hidden complexity there, but you can typically see that they're different from an application that really has a super complicated regulated core, say something dependent on German tax law, which is probably the worst thing, or I don't know, some super complicated production planning logic that feels different, right? I would not think of approaching an algorithmically complex problem, or that's the wrong terminology. A problem that's complex from the domain perspective. I would not dare approach that with a simplistic approach, right? So I would invest a little more and think about either the rich domain model in OO fashion, or maybe one of those algebraic solutions. Sometimes there are things that have different priorities, and then I would choose one of the others. So I'm sort of evading the question again. I don't think there are metrics, so the answer is no. I think there are some kind of obvious indicators that you can look at. But again, maybe think of the decision spheres of those contexts as chances to try out what works best, right? So you start with something, and if it doesn't work out, then you throw it away and start again. Or you can prototype it twice and say, well, let's have one team use that approach and one team that, and we compare it after 2 weeks and throw one of them away. I don't know.
Terrific. Great. So the third question's a little longer. I'm just going to read the entire thing. A very hot topic is the data-driven company. How do you see the relationship between wanting to be data-driven with all its ownership and governance of data, and using strategic domain-driven design as the structuring approach with ownership and governance of domains?
Right. So that's a fantastic question, I think, and that's a super hot topic in many places at the moment. So you might or might not be familiar with the idea of a data mesh, which is something that's come up in the last few years. Some of my colleagues, Simon Hara, Jochen Christ, are extremely active in that particular regard. And there's a ton of material out there. I can put a link in the chat after the talk. I think this is sort of the issue of how do you get together, how do you consolidate the idea of autonomy and decentralization with this gather all the data in one particular place. And the approach that the data mesh people take is to hand responsibility for specific data products to the teams. So in my particular example, each of those contexts would be responsible for a certain data product or set of data products that they would then hand over or deliver to some centralized platform that can actually make sense of that. So it's sort of a distribution of the data creation, consolidation, and interpretation responsibilities among different parties in that thing. And ideally, the boundaries of the data approach or the data governance approach match the boundaries of the software development approach, because you want those things. You could argue it's not only a DevOps team or a DevSecOps, it's a data DevSecOps UX product and whatever team, because the more you can get to an end-to-end responsibility for something, the more speed you'll get and the more motivation you'll get out of those particular teams.
Yes, I think that was a very succinct answer to, as you said, a complex question. The next one, I believe, is fairly simple to do. Could you please give us the title and author of the DDD book you referred to?
Yes, that will be the first one by Eric Evans. I'm not sure I have the title ready right now, but it's sort of the first hit that it's tackling the complexity in the heart of software. That's the name, and I'll put the Amazon link in the chat. Maybe you can pass it along.
Terrific. We'll get that into the Hopin chat in just 1 second there. Mm-hmm. And finally, how far can we opt for DDD in a highly changing requirement? Domain-driven design is usually recommended for complex business logic projects. However, some project requirements look easy at their first version, but end up with complex business logic. Is there any symptoms that could be noticed at the beginning that maximize the use of DDD?
Right. I mean, one of the standard answers is that you'll always be wrong, right? So you try to build something that'll be good for the next 10 years, and in year 3 you'll find out where exactly you were wrong in your assumptions, and there's basically nothing you can do about that part. You can only try to make your future selves life easier, right? So I always think of future Stefan. Will he be happy with what I'm deciding today? And my experience is that you have to create things that allow you to change your mind completely. So in a certain degree, that means that you go back on, or you scale back on what it is that you want to define in detail, because that'll hurt you in the long run. So only define very few things, and then make sure they are adhered to. And one of those things is, to me, the idea of separating things so that you don't end up with a code base with 10 million lines that you'll then have to make decisions about as a whole, because that always is extremely painful. That's the worst thing that can happen to you, to have such a large code base that you need to adapt to. So splitting it into smaller parts is, to me, something that's sort of a key insight. It matches this bounded context idea again. And this particular thing, you would just accept that there are some contexts that you completely throw away and rewrite from scratch when you decide that whatever you chose back then is just no longer viable. It might have been then, but it's no longer now.
Terrific. I love that idea of thinking about what would cause the least pain to your future self there.
Be nice to yourself.
Yeah, exactly. I believe we have time for one final question. This one, I suspect, might also have one of those "it depends" answers, but where's the starting point of an existing project? Can you give me a good starting point for that?
An existing project can, of course, be everything, right? It can be something where you're busy extending things, and sometimes, at least that's my experience, you come to this point where it feels too hard to add something new. It no longer feels like a straightforward thing to do. You have the feeling that you're wasting a lot of your time adapting to the existing environment and figuring out and you're sort of demotivated before you even start, because you know that it's going to be extremely painful. And my experience with those kinds of things is that it sometimes makes sense to put a second thing next to your existing system. Say, okay, this is the new stuff. In the long run, we will move to a system of systems, and this new thing that we're building could be the first new extra system that we're building. So you have a lot of freedom there in your technology choices. You could do things better than it did in the past in a more modern fashion. And it sort of forces you to figure out how to integrate those two things, because, of course, your users don't care about your architectural ideas, and they want to have a single experience of those two systems, of them acting as one. And that means that you'll figure out how you can build a new system that coexists with the existing one. And then you can apply what's typically called a strangler pattern to sort of slowly move things out of the old one into new things, if that's your thing, or add new features in new systems. So, of course, it's much harder to start with existing systems, but that's just the downside of real life, right? I mean, on a Keynote or PowerPoint slide, everybody can make everything easy. In the real world, we'll have existing systems to deal with, and we'll have to figure out how to get the existing organization there. So it's much more interesting and challenging to do it then, of course.
I think that is incredibly insightful, and I've certainly seen that starting with a new feature kind of thing work on teams I've been a part of. I think that's a great place for us to kind of end the question period. And I just want to say thank you again for joining us on such short notice, and best wishes to Carola today. And I think you stepped in excellently, even though, as you said, no one can quite replace her. It's been great to see you.
Great to see you too. Thanks you for having me, and enjoy the conference, everyone.
Great.